The breeze of early summer transported the fragrance of jasmine across the village plaza. Though the perfume failed to mask the acrimony of events transpiring there, particles of earth swirled around the feet of assembled villagers, their expressions hardened with condemnation, their murmurs reduced to an expectant hush. At the epicenter stood a young woman, her posture erect despite her frame quivering. Lynn held her 2 infant daughters pressed against her body, the children barely 12 months old, their plump faces moistened with weeping. Her tresses, once flowing and lustrous, lay in a mound at her feet, severed by the crude hands of her deceased husband's relatives. The men responsible, Marcus and David Brennan, retreated now with contemptuous grins distorting their mouths. They were robust men, hardened by agricultural toil, their skin weathered, their eyes illuminated with something more malevolent than the sun itself. One still clutched the scissors gleaming in his grasp. The other expelled saliva into the earth and proclaimed her dishonored, declaring she and her children bore the stigma of degradation. The infants, Rose and Lily, their diminutive heads stripped bare, whimpered in bewilderment, their cries absorbed by the dense silence of spectators. None advanced to intervene. The constable reclined against a column outside the tavern, arms crossed, his jaw tense, yet his form motionless. Women on verandas clutched wraps more securely around their shoulders, murmuring to each other that it was a harsh thing. But what could be accomplished? Men at the ironworks crossed their arms, shaking their heads as though this were merely a necessary remedy. The village had drawn its boundary, and Lynn stood on the incorrect side of it. Her husband, deceased 2 winters prior, had been a man lacking much tenderness. He had transported her westward from Sacramento, a Chinese bride in territory that scarcely acknowledged her existence. When illness claimed him, the Brennan brothers, his kinsmen, claimed her destiny as theirs to determine. To them she represented a burden, a woman too foreign to bear honor and too impoverished to stand independently. Thus they shaved her head and her children's, leaving them exposed before the entire settlement, as if to strip away not merely hair, but dignity itself. Lynn's hands trembled as she drew her daughters nearer, their small arms grasping at her neck. She did not weep, not where the assembly could observe, but her dark eyes glistened as she stared at the ground. Her lips compressed thinly, refusing to plead. She was resolved that if she was to be cast aside, she would not grant them the satisfaction of her tears. Yet within her chest, her heart pounded so violently, it seemed it might burst free and collapse in the dust at her feet. Marcus elevated his voice to the gathering. He declared she was unfit to remain with respectable folk, that she would find no roof under their protection. He called her a curse, a burden, a shame they would not bear. David laughed and said, perhaps some wanderer might accept her, though none with sense would choose a shorn woman with 2 wailing babes. The laughter dispersed thinly across the crowd, brittle and uncomfortable, for cruelty never sat fully comfortable, even among those who tolerated it. Children in the crowd pressed against their mother's skirts, wide-eyed, staring at the twins who now resembled them only in form, their bare little scalps gleaming under the midday sun. Lynn felt her own body tighten around them, as though her arms alone could shield them from the stares, the whispers, the harsh truth of rejection, and then movement. A tall figure stepped from the margins of the crowd. He was not one who often lingered in the plaza. His existence was constructed of labor far beyond village limits. Ethan Stone, 32 years of age, a rancher whose property stretched toward the riverbank, walked forward with measured, unhurried strides. The dust seemed to retreat from his boots, the murmurs faltering as he passed, broad-shouldered, sun-bronzed, with eyes the shade of weathered granite. He carried no weapon in hand, no arrogance in his gait, only steadiness. He came to stand before Lynn. She lifted her gaze, startled. Her breath caught in her throat. None had ever stood between her and the contempt of others. Ethan did not speak immediately. His hand reached, not for the scissors that still gleamed in Marcus's grasp, but for the bundle of fabric where one of the twins buried her tear-streaked face. His fingers brushed the child's back, firm yet careful, and then his eyes moved to Lynn. In that silence, the plaza seemed to contract, the crowd dissolving into a blur of colour and shadow. Only his eyes mattered. They did not glance at her shorn head, nor at the trembling curve of her shoulders. They held her level and unashamed, as though she were whole, as though she were more than the cruelty done to her. Then his voice came low and steady, carrying across the plaza like a slow bell. "You're coming with me." The words dropped heavy as stones, scattering whispers into gasps. David stepped forward, protest rising in his throat, but Ethan's gaze cut him down before the words could form. Marcus sneered, saying Ethan was a fool to burden himself with a woman marked so plainly. But even his laughter sounded thin now. Lynn's lips parted, but no sound emerged. For a fleeting moment, she thought perhaps he mocked her too, that this was but another twist of cruelty. But the way he bent, lifting one twin into the crook of his arm with practiced strength, left no doubt. His other hand reached for the second child, who clung to Lynn's torn dress. Gently, without haste, he gathered them both. Their small bodies quieted against him, as if some deep instinct recognized safety. Lynn stood frozen, her arms suddenly emptied, her soul torn between disbelief and relief so fierce it frightened her. Ethan looked at her again, not asking permission, not demanding trust, but offering it in the quiet steel of his presence. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped forward, her bare feet dragging through the dust until she reached his side. The crowd erupted then, voices rising, arguments flung like stones. They shouted that she did not belong, that he would regret this, that the village would not stand for it. But Ethan did not turn back. With one child against his chest and another balanced securely in his arm, he moved, guiding Lynn with the simple power of his stride. Constable Hayes shifted uneasily by the tavern post, his hand resting on his belt buckle, but he did not intervene. Perhaps he saw the futility, or perhaps he knew something of Ethan's nature that the others forgot, that this was a man who did not bend once he had set his course. The summer breeze carried blossoms from the jasmine vines, scattering them over Lynn's bowed head and the baby's gleaming scalps. She touched the place where her hair had been, feeling instead the brush of the petals, as if nature itself covered her shame with gentleness. The murmurs of the crowd followed them down the street, but Ethan's silence was louder than all of it. They walked past the general store, past the blacksmith, past the gossiping verandas, until the village fell behind them. Lynn's breath came ragged, her heart unsure if it beat from terror or salvation. She dared one glance upward at the man beside her. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the horizon, yet in the firm line of his mouth, she read something unexpected. Not pity, not pride, but resolve. Behind them, the Brennan brothers cursed, their voices carried faintly on the breeze. The village murmured like restless cattle, already bristling at Ethan's defiance. Trouble would follow. She knew it as surely as she knew the weight of her daughters in his arms. But in that moment, shame shifted inside her, loosening its grip. For the first time since the scissors had cut through her hair, she felt a breath of dignity return, carried on the steady pace of his boots. The road out of the village stretched long, the prairie grass swaying green in the warming air. Lynn's bare feet stumbled on stones, but Ethan slowed without looking at her, matching her steps as though he had always walked beside her. The children stirred, their cries softening into hiccups, lulled by the rhythm of his stride. Lynn pressed her hands together before her chest, unsure if she prayed or simply steadied herself. She had been cast out, stripped of all she thought she was. And yet this stranger gathered her up without question. Her mind reeled with fear of what he wanted, of what the village would do, of what awaited beyond this moment. But her heart, weary and battered, clung to the only truth it felt, that she was not alone in the dust anymore. The horizon glowed amber with the promise of sunset. Ethan stopped once, and when the last sound of the crowd faded behind them, Ethan Stone, with a weight of defiance and mercy both upon his shoulders, whispered words she alone could hear, words that sealed the course of all that was to come. You're mine to protect now. The prairie stretched wide and open, green shoots lifting toward the sun, the sky pale with the promise of another gentle summer day. Ethan Stone's cabin stood on a low rise beyond the riverbank, weathered but sturdy, its roof patched with new shingles, its porch swept clean as if waiting for something more than a man's solitude. When he guided Lynn and her 2 daughters across the threshold, silence hung between them like a fragile veil. The babies clung to her skirts, their small bare heads shining in the lamplight, their eyes darting across the unfamiliar room with a mix of wonder and unease. Ethan placed a kettle over the fire, his movements slow, deliberate, as though not to startle her. He did not ask questions about what had been done to her in the village, nor did he mention the murmurs that would already be spreading from porch to porch. He simply ladled warm water into a basin and set it before her on the rough-hewn table. She hesitated, fingers tightening on the worn cloth at her waist, then lowered herself onto the bench. The steam rose to meet her face, and for the first time that day, her body eased just enough to release a breath she had been holding since the scissors cut through her hair. Her daughters, Rose and Lily, toddled unsteadily across the plank floor. One reached for the legs of Ethan's chair, gripping it with chubby hands, while the other pressed her forehead against her mother's knee. Lynn gathered them close, whispering words soft and lilting, syllables that Ethan could not understand, but which calmed the little ones until their sobs slowed to hiccups. He listened without turning his head, as though her voice was music, too private to stare at directly. The hours stretched quiet. Lynn studied the cabin, noting the neatly stacked wood by the hearth, the plain bed tucked in the corner, the shelves holding jars of beans and flour. No woman's touch had softened the space, yet it bore no neglect either. Everything was orderly, functional, tended with care. She wondered what it meant for a man to live alone in such silence, with no children's laughter, no second voice to share the burdens of the seasons. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was low, almost hesitant, as though the stillness itself demanded respect. "You'll sleep here." He gestured toward the bed. "I'll take the floor." Lynn shook her head quickly, words tumbling in her own tongue. Before she caught herself, she pressed her lips tight, then whispered in halting English, "No, children, floor." Her hands clutched the fabric of her skirt, ashamed of her broken speech. But Ethan only set down another quilt on the boards near the hearth and shook his head once. "Bed's yours." No argument in his tone, no expectation either, just fact, solid as stone. That night she lay stiff upon the mattress, her daughters curled against her sides. The firelight cast long shadows across the beams, and through the crack of her lashes, she saw Ethan stretched on the floor with his arm draped across his chest. His breathing was steady, untroubled, and for reasons she could not name, she felt safer with that sound than she had in many years. Still, her fingers brushed the smooth skin of her shorn head, and tears slipped silently into the pillow. Morning light poured through the window, scattering gold across the room. Ethan was already outside, his figure outlined against the open pasture. Lynn watched from the doorway as he worked, his broad back bent to mend a fence rail, his movements unhurried but precise. He did not look back at her, yet somehow she felt he knew she stood there, and that he allowed her the dignity of deciding whether to step forward or retreat. She chose forward. The damp earth clung to her feet as she crossed the yard, Rose tugging at her skirt while Lily toddled behind. Ethan straightened, dusting his palms, and handed her a coil of rope. She blinked at it, uncertain. He knelt then, guiding her fingers to the splintered wood, showing her how to tie the knot firm enough to hold, but not so tight it would snap. She listened carefully, repeating his motions, her eyes narrowing in concentration. When the fence stood straight again, Ethan gave one short nod, the smallest of acknowledgements, yet it sent a warmth through her chest. Later, when she boiled rice over the stove from the small pouch she had carried all the way west, Ethan ate without complaint. Though the grains were plain and few, he did not remark on the taste, nor on the way she bowed her head while serving. When he refilled her daughter's bowls before his own, Lynn's throat tightened, though she said nothing. Days passed in this rhythm, unspoken, yet steady. Lynn swept the cabin floor, patched a tear in his shirt with careful stitches, and washed the children's clothes by the creek. Ethan hauled water, chopped wood, and returned from the village with sacks heavier than usual, though he never said what gossip he endured there. Sometimes, when dusk softened the fields, he showed her how to coax seedlings from the soil, his hands cupping hers as he pressed corn into the earth. She felt the roughness of his palms, the steadiness of his touch, and though he released her quickly, the imprint lingered long after. But the world beyond the riverbank was not so quiet. One afternoon, Mrs. Patterson rode up, her bonnet shadowing a face, lined with both kindness and worry. She dismounted, eyes sweeping from Lynn's bowed head to the twins chasing one another in the grass. Ethan met her at the gate. "Folks are talking," she said softly. "Some don't take kindly. You ought to be careful." Ethan only inclined his head, his jaw tightening, but Lynn felt the weight of those words settle in her stomach like stones. That night she asked him in her broken English, "Why help?" Her eyes searched his face. Fearful of the answer, Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then set aside the knife he had been sharpening. His reply came slow, simple, because no one else would. And then he turned back to his task, leaving her to wrestle with the meaning. The first sign of malice came under moonlight. A stone shattered the window, scattering glass across the floor where the twins had been sleeping moments before. They woke shrieking, clinging to their mother as she gathered them against her chest. Lynn's pulse thundered with terror. Ethan strode to the doorway, rifle in hand, his figure framed by the glow of the fire. Outside, the night was empty, but for the rustle of leaves, the guilty silence of retreating footsteps. He stood there long after, his shoulders rigid, until the sky lightened at the edges of dawn. In the days that followed, Lynn could not shake the fear. She tied her scarf tighter around her head, ashamed of her naked scalp, ashamed too of the way she trembled when her daughters cried. But Ethan never spoke of the stone, never asked her to leave. Instead, he worked beside her as though nothing had changed. Though his rifle now leaned against the cabin door by night once, while gathering water, she caught her reflection in the creek. Her scarf had slipped, revealing the cruel boldness that marked her shame. Tears pricked her eyes. Behind her, Ethan approached quietly, setting down the pail. His gaze touched her exposed head, then rose to meet her eyes. He said nothing, only bent to fill the bucket, and in that silence, she felt a strange mercy. He had seen her shame, and yet he looked through it as though it did not exist. Rose and Lily began to laugh again, their tiny feet pattering across the porch, their voices ringing bright against the hills. They clambered onto Ethan's boots, gripping his legs as though he were a tree, and he allowed it, lifting them onto his shoulders, one by one. Lynn watched, her heart swelling with both joy and dread, for each smile they shared. Here was a debt owed to the scorn of the village. For each kindness Ethan gave, the world outside sharpened its knives. One evening, after a meal of beans and cornbread, Lynn whispered her thanks, her voice breaking. Ethan looked at her across the table, his expression unreadable, and answered only, "You owe me nothing." Yet the words wrapped around her like a blanket, though she feared their warmth could not last. The wind shifted as summer deepened. Clouds gathered heavy with rain, and whispers in the village gathered heavy with threat. At the general store, men muttered that Ethan had gone soft, that he was a fool for sheltering the shamed widow. The constable warned him quietly that patience was thin, that some talked of taking matters into their own hands. Ethan listened stone-faced, then loaded his wagon with supplies and drove back without a word. That night, the air carried a charge like lightning waiting to strike. Lynn laid her daughters down, smoothing their blankets, her heart tight with foreboding. Through the crack in the door, she watched Ethan sit on the porch. The twins stirred in their sleep, and Lynn pressed her back to the wall, listening to the sound of Ethan moving about outside, guarding against shadows. Her heart beat in a rhythm of fear and fragile hope, for she knew the village's patience was near breaking. And when the wind rose, rattling the shutters, and the firelight flickered across the rifle leaning by the door, she felt in her bones that the true test of this shelter had yet to come. Summer ripened into fullness. The fields beyond Ethan Stone's cabin, shimmering green under the wide blue vault of sky. Morning mist rose from the river and drifted across the pastures, softening the world until it seemed touched by some gentle hand. Lynn stood at the edge of the porch with her daughters clinging to her skirts, watching as Ethan led his mare to water. The children's bald heads gleamed in the sun, yet already a thin fuzz of hair showed, stubborn proof that what had been taken would grow again. Lynn tied her scarf tighter, though the memory of the scissors still pressed against her skull like a phantom blade. She carried shame the way others carried scars. Visible or not, it weighed the same. But the longer she remained here, the more that shame began to loosen, thread by thread, as Ethan's silent steadiness wove something new around her. He returned from the river with sleeves rolled, water dripping down his forearms. When Rose toddled toward him with arms outstretched, he bent without hesitation, scooping her onto his hip. Lily followed, tugging at his trousers, until he lifted her too, balancing both as though born to it. Lynn watched, caught between relief and something deeper she dared not name. The twins laughed so loudly their voices carried to the hills, and she wondered if the land itself leaned in to hear. In the village, whispers sharpened with every passing day. Mrs. Patterson rode by often, bringing eggs or gossip wrapped in cautious words. She warned Lynn quietly, her weathered hand pressing against hers for a moment of solidarity, that petitions were being passed. Names gathered to see her gone. Lynn bowed her head, feeling the old heat of shame rise again. But Ethan's voice cut through when he said plainly, "Let them talk." His calm was a stone wall, unmoved by the storm beating against it. Each day carved its own rhythm, shared tasks shaping an unspoken bond. Ethan showed Lynn how to plant corn in neat rows, his large hands guiding hers in the soil. When she tried alone, her lines wavered crooked, and she laughed softly in embarrassment. He said nothing, only bent to straighten them, the ghost of a smile flickering across his lips. She cooked rice with wild onions she had gathered by the creek. He ate with a quiet gratitude that made her chest ache. One evening, he returned with a broken rocking chair, salvaged from the barn. Lynn tilted her head in confusion as he knelt with tools spread across the floor. The twins perched nearby, giggling as they tried to hand him nails. Slowly, with care that seemed almost tender, he mended the joints until the chair stood solid again. He placed it before the hearth, gesturing for her to sit. When she did, rocking gently with Rose in her arms, tears sprang unbidden. She whispered a thank you in her own tongue, voice trembling. Ethan only nodded once, eyes resting on the fire. Later, she tried to give back what little she could. She embroidered his initials, clumsy, uneven stitches, into a square of cloth and set it folded on the table. When he found it, he looked at her across the room, something unreadable in his gaze. He placed the cloth carefully into his pocket as though it were worth more than gold. The bond deepened, not with grand gestures, but with silences filled by presence. When Lynn's scarf slipped one afternoon as she carried water, exposing the cruel baldness beneath, her breath caught in panic. But Ethan reached gently, tucking the fabric back with a touch so respectful it made her knees weak. She turned away quickly, tears burning her eyes. Yet in that moment, something shifted. Her shame no longer felt like hers alone to bear. The twins were the first to bridge the last gap. At dusk, they clambered across the floor toward Ethan, their tiny voices piping out a word Lynn had never taught them. "Papa," she gasped, heart leaping, ashamed that they had thrust such a name upon him. She reached to silence them, but Ethan only stilled, his large hands frozen mid-motion. Then, slowly, he lowered himself to his knees, letting them crawl into his arms. He did not correct them. His eyes lifted to Lynn, steady and certain, and though no words passed, the air between them filled with something vast and unspoken. But shadows lengthened too. At the general store, Ethan faced 3 men who muttered about his foolishness, their laughter hard-edged. One spat near his boots. Ethan did not reply. He stood taller, shoulders squared, and their words withered against his silence. Still, when he returned that evening, there was a tightness in his jaw, a watchfulness in his eyes. Lynn sensed it in the way he lingered on the porch after dark, the rifle resting across his knees. She sensed it too in her own chest, where dread coiled like smoke. The kindness blossoming between them was fragile, delicate as summer buds, yet the weight of the village's disapproval threatened to crush it before it flowered fully. She told herself not to hope, not to imagine more than what was. Yet hope grew regardless, fed by the smallest things. The way he poured water for her before filling his own cup, the way his eyes softened when the twins tugged at his beard, the way he walked beside her without hurry as she carried baskets of laundry to the creek. These were not the acts of a man pitying her. They were the acts of a man who saw her. One night while the children slept, she sat by the fire mending his shirt. The light flickered across her hands, tracing the delicate curve of her fingers against the rough fabric. Ethan watched silently from the other chair. When she pricked her finger on the needle, she gasped softly. He reached for her hand without thought, taking it in his calloused palm. His thumb brushed the small bead of blood. Their eyes met, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Then, he released her gently, as though aware of the precipice between them. She returned to her stitching, though her hands trembled. The next morning, Mrs. Patterson rode by again. Her voice was sharper now, the weight of village opinion pressing on her. "They're gathering at the hall, Ethan," she said, talking about forcing her out. Ethan's jaw clenched, his silence carrying more power than any reply. Lynn stood in the doorway, heart pounding, knowing the tide was rising against them. That night, Ethan worked long after sundown, sharpening fence posts, stacking wood with restless energy. Lynn laid the twins to bed, their small breaths even and soft. She stepped outside into the cool air, her scarf fluttering in the wind. Ethan looked up, sweat glistening on his brow, axe steady in his hands. For a moment, she saw not just the man who had rescued her from shame, but the man who now carried her fate upon his shoulders. Her voice broke the silence. No regret." Her English faltered, but her meaning was clear. Ethan lowered the axe slowly, meeting her gaze in the starlight. His answer came steady, Not once. The words struck her deeper than any kindness before. Not once. No hesitation, no apology. Only truth. She felt the sting of tears, but this time they did not fall from shame. Days passed, each heavier with tension. The twins laughed and played. Unaware of the storm gathering, Lynn tried to hold to those moments. Lily chasing butterflies in the field, Rose collapsing in giggles when Ethan lifted her high into the air. The world narrowed to these glimpses of peace, fragile yet radiant, while beyond the river, the village sharpened its knives. One evening, clouds gathered thick, the air heavy with the scent of rain. Ethan sat on the porch with his rifle across his lap, the whetstone rasping against the blade of his knife. Lynn watched through the window, her daughters curled in sleep, and felt her pulse quicken. The night carried an edge, the kind that came before lightning split the sky. She wrapped her scarf tighter, pressed her palm to the wall for steadiness, and understood that shelter could only hold so long against the fury of men. The twins stirred restlessly, murmuring in dreams, and Lynn bent to soothe them. When she straightened, she saw Ethan still outside, his figure a dark sentinel against the storm clouds. His eyes scanned the horizon as though expecting shadows to emerge at any moment. Her heart thudded. She thought of the petitions, the whispers, the stone that had shattered their window. She thought of the cruel laughter in the plaza when her hair fell to the dust. Beyond the porch, Ethan Stone stood tall, the rifle balanced in his arms, his face calm as carved stone. She had seen him mend fences, lift burdens, coax seed from earth, but never had she seen him like this. Every line of him taught with quiet readiness, as if the land itself had forged him for this moment. The sound came first, like a rumble of distant thunder, hooves and boots, men gathering in anger. From the bend of the road, shadows formed into figures. The constable's broad hat tilted low, his voice carried rough by the wind as he called for Ethan to step forward. Behind him, a cluster of villagers shifted, some clutching lanterns, others iron tools, and at the center, the Brennan brothers stood, with sneers curling their lips, their hatred sharp as knives. Ethan did not move. He rested the rifle against the porch beam and folded his arms, letting the silence stretch until even the crickets stilled. The constable cleared his throat, louder this time, saying they had come for the woman, that the people would not abide her presence, that Ethan was defying the will of the village. Inside, Lynn clutched the edge of the table, her heart pounding so violently she thought it might rattle the windows. Her daughters stirred in their sleep, sensing the shift. Whimpering faintly before settling again, she looked to Ethan, searching his face for fear, for doubt, but found none. Only a stillness deeper than the storm, pressing at the horizon. He spoke at last, his voice carrying steady as a church bell. "You'll not lay a hand on them. Not now, not ever." The words cracked across the crowd, drawing murmurs, some uneasy, others mocking. Marcus Brennan spat into the dirt, shouting that Ethan had been bewitched, that no decent man would ruin himself for a shamed foreigner. David raised his fist, calling for her to be dragged out and sent down the road where she belonged. Before Ethan could reply, Lynn stepped to the doorway, her scarf trembling loose in the wind. She could have hidden, could have cowered behind the man who had chosen her fate, but something stronger rose in her chest. She pulled the scarf away, letting the wind touch the bare scalp the brothers had left her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some turned their faces, others leaned forward hungrily for spectacle. But Lynn's eyes found Ethan's, steady and unshaken. Then she lifted her chin and spoke in broken, yet firm English, each word carved with the weight of her soul. "I am not ashamed. My children will not live in fear." The Brennans laughed, but the sound faltered, for in her voice there was no begging, no plea, only defiance rooted in pain turned to steel. The constable's hand shifted at his belt, fingers brushing the holster, but he did not draw. His eyes flicked between Ethan and Lynn, something like hesitation creeping into his stance. Ethan stepped down from the porch, boots sinking into the damp earth, his frame casting long shadows in the lantern light. He faced the men, his rifle easy at his side, his jaw firm. "You want to fight, you'll have to go through me." His voice did not rise, but its calm struck harder than any shout. The villagers wavered, eyes darting. A few shifted uneasily, muttering that this had gone far enough, that blood was not worth spilling for pride. Mrs. Patterson, drawn by the noise, pushed her way through, her bonnet blown back by the wind. She planted herself between Ethan and the constable, her voice sharp with unexpected fire. "Enough. This woman has harmed no one. These children laugh like any others. Shame on you all for chasing